Global currency markets are in turmoil, and now the Indian rupee has also joined in. The Fed has threatened to take the peak Fed funds rate to 4.5 to 4.75% by March, which means an unprecedented 475 basis points hike in just 12 months. The dollar index has shot up to 20-year highs, and the US bond yield has risen to highs of 4%, which were last seen in 2008, the dreaded year of Lehman. Actually, the current turmoil is being sometimes compared to 2008 crisis, sometimes to the 2013 taper tantrum crisis. Today, I have with me someone who has seen both these crises from the front seat, as it were. I have with me Dr. D Subbarao, former Reserve Bank Governor. He took office practically on the week when Lehman went down. He took office on September 6, 2008. Lehman happened on September 15, 2008. And towards the end of his 5-year term, we saw the ravages of the taper tantrum. So, Dr. Subbarao, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining me. Your perspective is very important to us. First, that is the question. Is the rupee, that vulnerable, like we saw it in the previous crises?
Well, without going into any quantitative measure of vulnerability, what is certain is that the rupee is under pressure. It depreciated by about 10% in the last 1 year.
Yes.
It's crossed the psychological barrier of 80 to a dollar. And foreign exchange reserves have come down by $100 billion from this time last year. We know that that pressure is coming because of two reasons. First, the current account deficit has widened, largely because of the increase in oil prices. Second, because of capital outflows triggered, importantly, by the financial tightening around the world, most importantly, the hike in interest rates by the US Federal Reserve. Now, it is certainly a cause for worry, but like you referred to the previous crisis, it's certainly not 2013, the taper tantrums. There's a big difference between the taper tantrums of 2013 and the situation today. For example, in 2013, the rupee was under pressure. There was a lot of pent-up exchange rate pressure in the rupee. It was overvalued, suddenly bled. This time, I think the rupee is tracking fundamentals more or less. Again, in 2013, we had the twin deficit problem, current fiscal account deficits year-on-year very high, leading up to the 2013 crisis. Today, this year, the current account deficit is expected to be high, but it's a one-off, hopefully. And on the fiscal, there's more credibility. And most importantly, we have the buffer of the foreign exchange reserves. So it's certainly not 2013. I would also say that it is less of a worry compared to what it was 6 months ago. If you compare to, let's say, March or April, oil prices come down to below $100. Our trade deficit, which was tracking about $30 billion per month, is now about, maybe it'll go down to $20, $22 per month on the average. So it's less of a worry, but I think if this situation persists, we will become vulnerable, and that will depend on a lot of global factors as well as domestic factors.
Okay. So, I agree. I mean, at the face of it, at that time, we were bracketed with the fragile five. Now, actually, people like Ruchir Sharma are bracketing us as the seven wonders, one of the seven, along with Vietnam, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, etc. So, yes, we are actually in the upper echelon. But, if you dig the current account deficit a little more, the extent to which crude, the incremental pressure brought on by crude was only about $4 billion. So there are economists like Somanan Chakrabarti who pointed out on the channel that from 30 we may come down to 26, 27. We may not really come down $10 billion. Services, a lot of Indians have traveled abroad. A lot of students are studying abroad. So even if you count services, our current account deficit looks like will be well over $100 billion, which means 3.5% of GDP. And since only a small bit is crude, even if crude comes down, our imports are high. Don't you think this is a window of vulnerability?
Well, certainly. There should be no presumption at all that we're going to get into a comfort zone very soon. That's not going to be the case. The rupee is under pressure, will continue to be under pressure. Like you said, this year, the current account deficit is expected to be 3 or 3.5% of GDP. The RBI used to estimate that a safe level of current account deficit for India is 3% of GDP. That was during my time. I think they got more conservative now. Now they talk about 2.5% as being the safe limit. And note this, in the 6 years leading to the pandemic, we had current account deficit at the range of 1.4 to 1.5% of GDP, so in very safe limits.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into about 3%. As I said a short while ago, if this is a one-off, it's okay. But if it's going to persist, and if it's going to come on top of fiscal deficits, which are high, not just the central government, but both the center and states put together, fiscal deficits are still, I wouldn't say scaringly high, but certainly quite high. That coupled with our current account deficit of over 3% of GDP certainly puts us in the vulnerable zone. And we're not going to get into a comfort zone anytime soon.
Okay. You said that if, given the recession fears, crude comes down, we could get a relief. If there are indeed recession fears, even our exports could come down, isn't it? After all, our imports are indispensable imports, some of it like crude and chips, whereas our exports, perhaps, like rice and textiles, are discretionary to some extent. Do you think that if the recession that seems to be now forecast by several economists actually happens, we may have a second year of current account deficit issues?
That's quite possible. The R word is upon us, and I think it's more probable, looks more probable today than it did even 3 months ago. And if there's a recession, our exports will be hit. And the exports have been a big driver of India's growth, particularly last year when we recovered from the crisis. That is driven largely by exports. So if exports are going to be dented because of recession, that's going to be vulnerability on the external front. But on the other hand, like you pointed out yourself, if there is a recession, oil price will come down. So how these two factors will play off, I really don't know. You must ask people, analysts who actually work on the numbers. But I believe that if there's a recession, India will continue to be vulnerable, perhaps more vulnerable than it is today.
Okay. Well, let me come to the reserves now. That is supposedly our trump card. Do you think that is seminally something which puts us better than in 2013?
Well, certainly. I would say that our foreign exchange reserves have been a buffer. But big caveats to that answer. Our foreign exchange reserves were a buffer, a strong buffer last year, but much less of a buffer now.
Oh.
I've seen some analyst numbers say that one metric of measuring the adequacy of foreign exchange reserves is as a proportion of GDP. That ratio, which was, I believe, about 21% last year, FY22, that is the reserves in FY20, end of 22, as a ratio of GDP in FY22, that's 21%. That is likely to come down to 17% this year, FY23. Reserves as a proportion of GDP. That's a big decline. Okay. And if you compare that ratio to what it was in 2013 and 2014, taper tantrums, that ratio is about 15%.
15, okay.
15. So we're not dangerously low, but I would say that our reserves are much less of a buffer than we thought last 3 months ago. And I would also say this in answer to this question, it's not just the level of reserves, but also the rate at which reserves are coming down, the burn rate as it were. I think that also shapes market perceptions.
Okay. Now let me come to other things that the Reserve Bank has. Of course, it has reserves. But do you think it needs to use the interest rate weapon now? Have we reached a time when we have to think very seriously of interest rate differential with the Fed?
We certainly have to think about it, and I'm sure the RBI thinks about it all the time, not just now, but all the time. Okay? Every central bank worries about what their interest rate stance is going to have on the exchange rate, particularly emerging economy central banks. No central bank, of course, admits to using the interest rate as an instrument for exchange rate defense, but all of them look at it. So when they do monetary policy calibration, they always look at what impact it's going to have on exchange rate, particularly because it is difficult to do all these things in compartments. You cannot say, this is monetary policy, this is exchange rate policy, this is financial stability policy. All of them are interlinked. We know this impossible trinity, right? They're all connected.
Yeah.
So RBI worries about it. But in a specific answer to your question, I would say that, the decision point has not come. Because even for inflation management, RBI will still have to tighten. So any interest rate tightening now will be consistent with interest rate defense as well. But down the line, let's say RBI hits 6% or whatever they consider to be the neutral rate from an inflation perspective. Will they then continue to tighten in order to defend the exchange rate? That will be a dilemma. That will be a big question. And that's a decision point, I would say. So it's at this time, it's not a critical decision to make.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you. At least in your time, you did not have this binding constraint of inflation targeting MPC. That is the kind of a straitjacket now. Do you think they will have to... See, we just discussed a little earlier that imports are growing irrespective or even without counting crude. So can we be in a situation that we have to cool down the current account deficit and the dollar rupee because it is getting exacerbated by huge demand, aggregate demand for imports? So does the argument, even from a rupee angle, increase to cool down demand and go with the interest rate instrument?
The RBI is anyway cooling down demand, right, with their interest rate policy. Okay, so their endeavor is to restrain growth in order to restrain inflation. That's happening anyway. The question is, should that be also targeted at restraining imports? Some of that will happen. But I would say that as much as they're using the interest rate to restrain demand and to slow down the economy, I should think they should also allow a depreciation of the rupee. Depreciation is inflationary, but it is also expansionary. But in my view, I think they allow the rupee to depreciate. It will restrain some of the imports that you're talking about, and it might support exports. So use the interest rate to cool down the economy, use the exchange rate to restrain imports and to encourage exports. And that, I think a mix of that will be a good policy situation right now.
Okay. So time permitting, I will come back to this issue of depreciation, especially because the Chinese yuan has depreciated a goodish bit. But there were another set of measures that were introduced in 2013 by the next governor. It was after your term ended. There were special schemes announced for NRIs to invest in India, where the cost was borne by Reserve Bank. Has the time come for such measures, or do you see it round the corner?
I'm not clued into the nitty-gritty, so I cannot give a precise answer.
Okay.
But 2 months ago, I believe we know that the RBI had taken certain measures to improve inflows, right? They had raised debt raising. They made debt raising easier. There were a lot of banks to borrow. They made ECB simpler or more comfortable, etc., etc. I don't know what impact they've had.
Okay.
To answer your question about whether the swap option or swap scheme that was introduced after my time by Governor Rajan, that worked very well at that time, I should say. Whether we should do it right now, I'm not sure, because it is costly. And also, it's like, let me use a word, it's like a Brahmastra. So if you use that, the market might get spooked.
Okay.
So I don't believe the time has come. If RBI or the government together want to do it, they must be very, very circumspect about whether they should do it, when they should do it, and how much of it they should allow.
Okay. Fair enough. Dr. Subbarao, I have to take a quick break, but I have some more questions on how the central bank can use some of its weapons in this suddenly dangerous external situation. I'm back in a minute. Welcome back. I've been speaking with former Reserve Bank of India Governor Dr. Subbarao. Dr. Subbarao, just to remind you, has seen a bit of the Lehman crisis because that's when he assumed office and his term ended with the taper tantrum. So has seen several cycles of foreign exchange problems in his time. Dr. Subbarao, thank you very much for your patience. The Reserve Bank did start with a great FX kitty, as we said. Do you think that they lulled the market into confidence about protecting an 80 number? Can the reserves have been used a little differently? I don't know how, but could it have been used differently so that 80 was not seen as calamitous?
Well, I think the Reserve Bank managers and foreign exchange dealers are smarter than the market gives them credit for. They're very smart people. So just as the market tries to game the RBI tries to be unpredictable, to act by surprise. This numbers that you talked about the psychological barriers RBI seem to be protecting 80 or 82 or whatever, I think these are narratives shaped by the market and attributed to the RBI. I would say that even if let's imagine that we're trying to construct a story that the RBI is trying to defend 81.75. I think you can construct a narrative about that.
Okay.
So RBI's managers know that, and they try to be smarter than the market. They try to be unpredictable. But if the market still sees them as defending a certain round number, a psychological number, I think it's more of the market perception than the RBI's actions.
Okay. Well, I might tell you from the media angle and as a person who speaks to Forex traders, the market thinks the world of RBI. They are really scared and believe that, the RBI desk can always give them. They definitely have more cards. They have 600 billion in terms of cards. But Dr. Subbarao, the fear about this, you alluded to the fact that RBI should use depreciation to, manage part of the problem, discourage imports, encourage exports, narrow the deficit. The problem with allowing the depreciation, for instance, beyond 80, is that often depreciation begets depreciation. Exporters think, oh, I will get 83 for the rupee, for the dollar. Importers think, oh, I have lost 80, let me go and book now. So do you think it can be handled that easily, depreciation as a tool?
It cannot be handled all that easily. That's for certain. Experience has taught us that. And I know from my own personal experience that it is not very easy, especially when the rupee is falling and the market expects it to fall further. But, there are perceptions about the rupee or any currency being in free fall. And when there is a very steep fall, there is also oftentimes an overshoot.
Yeah.
That is inevitable, and that's what central banks try to manage. But there is a limit. It cannot be that there is no floor. Even in 2013, which was a big crisis, when the rupee hit about 69, I think the market determined that that's about the level. They could have been overshooting, but then that level was seen to be the right level. So the reality is that even the RBI cannot defend the exchange rate against fundamentals. But what is the exchange rate according to fundamentals is something we will know only with hindsight. That's the problem. And the RBI tries to manage volatility as they say they do, and as I believe they actually try to do. But in my own view, the RBI, as much as they've done a great job before and after me, I think the RBI should be less interventionist than it's been historically.
That's sage advice. Dr. Subbarao, a slightly longish question in terms of comparison. Even in 2008, we thought we were different. Because our banks were well capitalized. It was the foreign banks which had, cheated their way out of capital norms and become highly leveraged. But crisis hit us about maybe 3 years later, probably because we were complicit and let our deficits run. The same thing could be said now. If you looked at the Fed dot plot, they are expecting the PCE, which they follow, to fall from 6.3 to about 2.3%. Whereas the RBI tells us that in 2024, the same time as the Fed expects 2.3 inflation, our inflation is going to be 4%. So very soon we are going to be 2 percentage points above the Fed, above the US PCE. Do you think we are being a little too sure of our macros?
First of all, I don't know about whether being sure about our macros, but our macros are vulnerable. That much is for certain. Because, like we talked about earlier in this conversation, fiscal deficits are high and they should be brought down. It's not just the central fiscal deficit, it's the combined fiscal deficit of the center and states, which I believe is running around over 10%. And if you take actual numbers, which are beyond the budgets, it might actually be higher. So the twin deficit problem is always there with us. So we should worry about that, our macro fundamentals. If we get our macro fundamentals strong, I think we will have the resilience to fight pressures coming from outside the country. In 2011, 12, or 13, the taper tantrums was, of course, a quintessential problem because of the twin deficits accumulated or year-on-year current account and fiscal deficits. So this time around, too, we should be worried about that, and we should do our best to bring them to safe levels.
Okay. All right, Dr. Subbarao, I've run out of time. I actually wanted to take the advantage of getting a former governor and ask him about the India growth story. But I promised you I will stick with foreign exchange, and I keep my word. I'll take a rain check from you to invite you yet again about the medium-term India growth story, which seems to be much better now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, sir.